detailed questions. So hopefully we can get to everybody.
And once in a while, we might actually be able to unmute somebody, because it would be fun to actually hear somebody talk aside from us.
Right.
Right?
So the question from Tracy might be a good one in regard to the pre-record. How do you pre-record and have a live Q&A?
Oh, very simple. So when you pre-record, you're going to use whatever tool you have. I like to pre-record on my phone because the camera here, I have an 11, is really good, and I use a tripod. You can pre-record on Zoom. The audio may not be as great. So you've got your MP4 or your WAV file, right, that then gets loaded and played when you have an audience. But then you are in the waiting room awaiting the questions, just like we're doing here with the moderator. This is kind of the standard conference method. A friend of mine just delivered a keynote to 500 people. I said, how'd it go? She said, well, you know, it was pre-recorded, but then I was live for the Q&A. So it has to do with how the system gets switched and who's actually able to, there's a, you know, a little bit of technology behind it. So hopefully that answers that.
Okay, numerous people ask where they can get the playbook.
Oh, so we have a slide. We have a slide for that too. I'll pull that up for y'all.
So you can go also to articulationinc.com/virtual-speaker. You're going to get the playbook and this recording and these last slides and all the slides all sent to you. So don't worry, if you've registered, you'll get that.
We have a lot of people asking about microphones and sound in the virtual format, so I thought I would just address that to everyone.
You want to? Can I show you what I'm using today too?
Sure.
You go ahead and start, and then we'll give you the options here.
So some people talked about the different sounds. Zoom actually recommends that you use a headset that's wired to your computer for best results. However, on the webinars that I attended where they said that, the people on that webinar were using wireless headsets. So take that for what you will. I'm using my Apple AirPods. So, and I often with clients even use just the AirPods that I got with my phone with a cord. So this is really great, especially when you want privacy and you, for some people who have confidentiality concerns and you don't want to play out of your computer, microphones through your headsets are a great way to go. And then Ruth has another option.
So I think that Acacia's option is really good because I think the sound quality is good. Can you see this, Acacia?
I can.
So I'm using an Audio-Technica microphone. This might be used for podcasting. I have a foam cover on it. It's got a stand. I also have a boom in my other office. This, you can tell how the quality is probably a little better and I don't have to shout as much. This is a really nice option, and it actually comes, this just had a USB port to here that's plugged right into my computer. Otherwise, I would just be talking and I might feel like I need to shout a little bit more if I wasn't on the microphone. So it's a good question. I want to address a follow-up one if I can to the what happens, how do you save a webinar if a presenter is really boring? What are things that the host can do? So let's say you've invited somebody to speak, it's live, you haven't done rehearsals, there's no pre-recording, and it's off, the train is off the tracks. My best recommendation is to make sure that you always have an agreement before the webinar starts with your speaker that you may interrupt and ask a question. And that is the best way to then kind of keep them narrowed in to say, I know you've got some content, but I see some questions here in the Q&A. And that should be a table stake for participating in any event, whether the presenter is going to be good or not. So hopefully Dave then answers that question. All right, we've got a whole bunch here. Let's keep going.
Let's see.
We will send you instructions on how to link the Kahoot. It's actually just sharing the screen. I just shared my web browser, and maybe we should address that.
I want to address Betsy's question about how difficult it is to read the room in presentations. I'm going to do this here. and how to stay on track without being able to see body language and facial expressions of your audience. And that really is one of the biggest challenges when you are in the webinar format, or if you're in a meeting where people don't have their cameras on. So what I would do is assume that your audience is losing attention with some frequency. So change things frequently to make sure that you're bringing them back. Beyond that, there has to be all that pre-work that you've done before any type of presentation you've given, probably, Betsy. That's got to be even stronger in its audience focus. Are you answering the question that's on the audience's mind? Because that's the first thing that will make them lose focus, is if you're not answering the question they came to get answered. I hope everyone here, we're getting the questions they thought they'd get answered today. Including stories is a great way to make sure that you're bringing people back in. Whether you can see them or not, we do know they work. If you've done all the prep work that you think will lead to great audience engagement, then at a certain point, as I'm experiencing right now, you just have to kind of sit back and assume this is going well. I do like being able to see the Q&As though. That does let me know that there was quite a bit of engagement because I can see the Q&As. Did you see another one you want to answer, Ruth?
Yes, yes. And I did find out who K2 was, so congratulations, Kelly, on winning the Kahoot. That was funny. Let's just, Nala asked if we go back to the slide with the pre-recording. We can just do that, and you can take a look at it. It's also in the playbook, but I'm going to go ahead and answer the next question. Acacia, can you just bring that up?
Which am I bringing up?
The pre-recorded staged slide.
Absolutely.
We have a bunch of questions actually about kind of the 100. I'll read Larry's here. Hi, Larry. Can you recommend a way to practice a Zoom meeting? So under 100 people. I'd like 20 friends to join, but I can't experiment with polls, breakout rooms in real time. That's hard to organize. So the way we do that is you actually, when you're practicing polls in a Zoom room, you actually just need one other person. And so, and you actually you may not even need another person to practice a poll in terms of launching it, but you need someone else to be able to answer it. So you don't actually have to have 20 people log on to rehearse anything. And also the difference between the Zoom room and webinar, just remember there's a limit in Zoom rooms that you can't have more than 100 people. So for instance, we have, I'll put a plug in for our 1-hour virtual classes. They are done on the Zoom room because, and we haven't talked about this at all, about breakout rooms. So breakout rooms are possible in Zoom rooms, but they're not in webinars. And a breakout room is just simply like saying to people, hey, everyone go down the hallway and get with a group, or it could just be you're already at a table of 6 or 7 people and you say talk amongst themselves. So a Zoom room allows you to break out. You can stay there as long as you want and then come back to a plenary, go back to a Zoom room. And that's actually, for groups of under 100, is one of the best engagement tools. But in a webinar for over 100, you don't have that option. So hopefully that clarified a few questions in there.
Simon's asking, we had a couple of things about lighting. Ruth has a different style of lighting than I do. It's a box light. I have some lights that are stuck on my wall and they're very bright. That does get tiring. So many of the tips that we've talked about today, we don't want to make people crazy with thinking this is how you have to be in a team meeting. This is not how we are in our team meetings. So the lights can be down a little bit more when you're in a team meeting that doesn't have as much at stake, is what I would say. Lighting can be really important though, just because it does allow people to experience a lot more of your facial expression, and they're trying to read that anyway. So we recommend lights when it's important, and they can get bright.
Speaking of lights, Kathy asks, is there a way to look at the screen without like getting too close? You know, when you get, it can be a little awkward, right? My eyesight isn't great. You could actually create a second screen situation where you can have that illuminated bigger, or you can just rely on your host to ask the questions, which we're not doing right now because we're just sort of hot seating these through. So hopefully that helps, Kathy. There's a question about the difference between Zoom, Teams, WebEx, Adobe Connect, etc. You want to try to take this, or do you want me to?
I think you're more expert in it than I am, Ruth.
So I have used all of those platforms when it's my client's platform: MS Teams, WebEx, Adobe Connect, GoToMeeting, etc. I don't have a lot of experience trying to do a webinar or a class. We did use WebEx once. It's pretty janky. Some people love Blue Jeans, other people don't. We think that Zoom actually provides, and they have done a ton of development in the last 3 months. When Zoom was launched really formally about 6 years ago, we became subscribers. So we've been watching its progress and are very pleased with how far it's come. The other ones are more expensive. Zoom is about, and this is where Kim might be able to forget, I think it's like $10 a person per license. So it's really quite affordable, and you can share a host license like Helmut and I share. If he needs to use it and I need to use it, we just schedule and make sure we're not walking over each other. The other ones like Teams and WebEx and Adobe Connect, they're going to be more enterprise level and they're going to be more expensive. So this is actually a very accessible platform.
Someone was asking a little bit more about the voice styles and tips to practice and learn these voices. It's a really great question. As you know, I come with a performance background, so some of that is something that I've worked on for a lot longer. What I would tell people when I coach them is that you really should try and imagine what you're trying to get your audience to do. And if you can imagine that while you're saying the words, you're an effective communicator when you're not thinking about it most of the time. So I would recommend think about what you want them to do and see what your voice does, and then over index for a little while. Most people tend to be very small in the variety of their voice, especially if you're on this call from the Midwest. Our vocal variety here in the Midwest tends to be very narrow. So I would invite you to play with singing things that you want to say as practice, not in front of your audience, or discovering the different ways to use your voice. And then ultimately use a recorder on your phone to record yourself and then listen back. Can you hear a difference in your voice, and what effect does it have on you?
Good. I'm going to just answer 2 or 3 really fast. Do the games have to be relevant to the presentation material? No, absolutely not. One of my best friends is an instructional designer, and we were talking about when to use polls. There's a lot of conjecture out there about how to use polls, but we struggle sometimes with speakers. You've got a whole presentation set up, and then it says, okay, insert a poll, and sort of how do you think about that? Our answer, which we didn't go too deep into, by the way, is always have a poll at the beginning like we did, try to have a poll in the middle and poll at the end. The middle one could be a transition of content, like we used Kahoot in actually testing your knowledge. Did you hear us or not? And it got us to reinforce points. But I've done plenty of Kahoots where I throw in a question that's totally irrelevant and just makes people laugh. Or more importantly, always throw in like an answer that's really silly that makes people laugh, and you know, of course, that's not the answer. There's always one answer you throw away, and it gives people like, oh, I know that's not the answer. So humor and sort of having fun, Sarah, is part of the game here. And if you can just bring them back by getting them to emote somehow, by making them laugh with a joke or some humor button, through a game, through a presentation, through a poll, we highly recommend that. It's not that you're distracting from your content, you're actually bringing their focus back to your content. Okay, let's keep going. These are great questions. I don't know what your number is, Emily, dear Emily Armstrong. I'm gonna see if we can, just for fun, hold on. I don't know if I can find you or not. She looks like she's gone. Anyway, she asked about, how do you shut down the people who get too competitive? I don't know. I think that's a good sign of like somebody who's engaged, actually. So it's better than them being bored and distracted and not there. Do you want to address Richard's question? Acacia, should a speaker sit or stand? We talked about it a little bit, but
Yeah, we talked about that a little bit. My feeling is that when you sit, there's an intimacy that comes with sitting. So you may err on the side of sitting the more intimate you want the conversation to feel. Because obviously, right now, if you're looking at me, I look very much like I'm right with you and I'm talking directly at you, and not that I'm talking to a group. So there's a lot of intimacy this way. If you still want it to be more about I'm speaking to a group of people and a little less intimate, so this puts it more formal, then you might try the way Ruth has set herself up. This is much more of a style when you want a little bit more formality, or you want to be able to look as if you're in the room with them rather than sitting across from them. That might be a way to think about it.
I would invite everyone to also, because these both were pre-recorded talks that were delivered through through graduation programs in the last few weeks. If you looked at Tim Cook's talk to Ohio State, he was sitting at a chair with a very staged kind of backdrop. He was the CEO of CEO of Apple. And he was kind of having a fireside chat. His talk was about 7 minutes, was very powerful, and he was also reading it. So in some instances, having that seated position, if you've got a teleprompter, and we haven't talked about teleprompters at all, Acacia, we can address that. And then you could have watched Mike DeWine's graduation talk from Miami. Shout out to those who are Miami grads with me on the call. He stood at the hub with, wind flowing, and I don't know, I think he probably used a few cue cards, but it also felt very conversational. But he was in the location, he actually snuck on campus, and having him deliver that talk on campus was really important. So there were environmental considerations on both of those, but I think that those are, they were both very intentional. I think that that's the goal, is be intentional about what you're doing, and make it work for you. So do you want to talk about, keep going, what do you have next?
Someone was asking about, can you enable Zoom webinar to see your audience? This is a great also differentiation when you're thinking about Zoom meeting versus Zoom webinar. Zoom meeting allows for the audience to use their videos. Zoom webinar is designed not to do that. So when they designed Zoom webinar, according to Zoom, when I heard them talking about it, they were looking for more of a platform where the presenter has a lot more control and the participants have a little less control. So webinar is great when you want that control, or you have a very, very large audience, which usually go hand in hand. The bigger the audience, the less control you can give them. So meeting is always better if you want to be able to see people.
And I would also say, for those of you who might be on your way to speaking at a much larger conference, you're gonna want to just pay a lot of attention. There are actually 75, I should have mentioned this before, there are actually 75 different kind of meeting platforms. Some are more mature than others that are evolving. And some of those are to be able to manage thousands of participants and hundreds of speakers. And the one that we're working with, this conference we're working with, is actually using Zoom through their platform. And then other times they're using other technologies. So you're gonna, if you are headed to an academic conference or some sort of trade conference, you're gonna just kind of keep your mind open about what they're using and what you're familiar with, and just keep adding to your knowledge, because things are changing all of the time. I'd like to address Amy's question. Suggestion for audiences less familiar with technology. You want to?
Sure. We had, at the beginning, we did a little bit of hygiene, and I went through that with a medium fast pace, assuming that the audience who signed on for this were primarily people who were already a little bit familiar with the online platforms. If you don't know if they are, you want to go at a little bit of slower pace. Most web platforms have available slides that you can use to show how to use their platform. So the one that I took you through actually came through Zoom. I'll see if I can discover the link and put the link in the comments here before we get off today. That can be helpful to use their images. They built the slide and everything for me, so that was very easy. But I highly recommend take them through where the stuff is, and then also right away get them to use it. And then every time you ask them to use it, slow down and give the directions step by step with a lot more pausing. I heard a really great tip from someone that was, assume that the capability of the person who's on your webinar or on your meeting is about the same level as your 80-year-old grandmother. And if you know that you can figure out how to tell your 80-year-old grandmother how to do it, then you are ready to explain it to any audience. So that's a good way to prepare yourself.
We have two other really interesting questions. And I actually, just because I want to test this, Rachel Bernhardt, I'm actually going to try to get you to talk. So it looks like you're still on. And I'm going to allow you to talk.
Hello.
Yay, you're there. So this is something I wanted to do today, is actually show everyone how we can enable somebody to talk. We're still not going to be able to see you, but go ahead and pose your question live to us about the classroom setting and the newsprint. I think this is a good one to address.
We bring people in from all over the country in small groups, and we're trying to avoid that at this time, but we use a lot of newsprint and other things. I was just asking if I should try to do that in a Ruth type setup where I could have it next to me, or if I should stick with slides. And I don't know, maybe I'm guessing there's some sort of on-screen whiteboard option.
Whiteboard. Okay, I wasn't sure when you said newsprint if you actually were like passing out newspapers, or you're used.
Well, it's flip chart paper. I don't know. We've always called it newsprint for 100 years. I don't know why we call it that.
Acacia, can we can't use whiteboards here, can we?
I can actually. I'll pull one up right now.
So Rachel, we're going to show you live how this works. In a classroom setting that's not necessarily a webinar, Acacia's going to show you, she's opened up a whiteboard on her screen. And actually, because I am a co-host, I am able to also write on it. Now, I can't move where my information is. Acacia's very good at drawing. So you can type or you can draw, and you can invite others to actually type and draw. We use this function every Monday morning at our staff meetings. Acacia will pull up a whiteboard. We have a grid that we go through because we use Traction and the L10 at EOS process, for those of you who are familiar with that. And we have 5 or 6 categories of things that we populate, and everyone has a few minutes to populate on there. So that's how we use it. If you were brainstorming or needed a whiteboard, this is what we recommend that you use. You can actually export it, Rachel, and share it with everyone as a PDF when you're done. And Acacia, show me how you can move what I've just written. She's got a function to be able to move that around.
So this is an outside program. It's not part of Zoom.
It is.
It is part of Zoom.
This is this is a function within Zoom. And most of them have it when you are the host or a co-host. As a participant, I'm not sure, I have to remember what the rules are and who gets to use the whiteboard in webinar. Well, in webinar, only the panelists and hosts can use it. In Zoom rooms, most of the time, I'm pretty sure anyone can use it. You would go and actually, for those of you who are curious, you go and you go to view options and it click down to annotate. And then a toolbar comes up that allows you to do a number of fun things, like adding another box.
Okay.
So that's the virtual way, and then you can obviously have preloaded slides with other information ready to share in your screen from a deck, a PowerPoint, or a Keynote. So that would be something you would integrate with Zoom. You wouldn't build inside Zoom. Any media that you're using, PowerPoint, Keynote, a video, Kahoot, are things that you're going to actually then share your screen, because you're actually going to, bring it into the Zoom. You don't build it in the Zoom.
I want to actually invite, if this person is willing.
Thank you, Rachel, for that.
Thanks.
If this person is willing, M. Conley had a question that I would love to elevate, but hear how M. Conley might express this question about when you might schedule these things to maximize attention. Can you help?
I think that's Maureen. You could go over and find her.
More, no, there's M. Conley.
Yes, there she is. Okay, Maureen, are you up? Are you here? Can you unmute yourself? She's not paying attention. Oh, wait, there's unmute. She's not.
No. All right, well, Maureen asked about the preferable time to actually schedule these things to maximize attention. I find that a really great, interesting question. And I don't know that I know like the true 100% answer to that, but I do think it's helpful to think about when the audience that you have will be at their best as well. So if you need them to be able to learn new things, probably not towards the end of the day, because or after a lot of other meetings, because our brains are getting tired. So if you need learning to happen maybe earlier in the day or before they get meetinged out. To that end, we also have begun talking with a lot of our clients about being very deliberate about when you decide to have the meeting be via Zoom or some virtual technology, when you might use just a telephone call or a conference call, or when you might use Zoom without videos on. This is because it is a lot more energy, both on the person who is speaking when you have your video on, but also on the listeners. There's a lot to pay attention to, and there's a lot more visual feedback. So we like to err on the side of, if you want to concentrate just on the ideas, you may want to consider maybe not having the video. When it's important that you have that rapport being built, that you see the way I might feel about it, or that you connect with people, then the video becomes important. But because it's more tiring, we don't think you should use all Zoom all the time.
Right. All right, let's move on to Kim has a question, which I think is really, really relevant here. So she's asking, how do I use a Jolt or Kahoot or other platforms when the subject is sensitive, like mental illness? I'm going to tackle this one. So if you start with the premise that you have a communication goal or a learning goal, right? You're going to create content and structure and messaging that's appropriate for that content. That makes sense. So if my goal in mental illness is to raise awareness and it's got sensitive information, I'm going to write it and organize it and structure it with that content in mind. And then I'm going to find, like I answered earlier, I'm going to find appropriate ways inside that existing content to use a Kahoot or a Jolt or a poll that reinforces that learning, reinforces the myths that I might be trying to demystify, or it could be that I'm just trying to check in to see what actions you might take. So you're always going to use the tools in concert with the goal and sort of the genre, the intent of the content. You're never going to try to do a dance party when you're talking about death, probably, right? You're going to be more inside the spirit of the intention. Starting to ramble, but I think that's what I wanted to get out. And I think I just answered that. How do you make the visual jolts relevant? Remember, a jolt is just simply changing something up to get people to connect, to continue to connect the knowledge.
I can add to that too. When we coach our speakers, when they are giving presentations, sometimes we try and get them to focus on when they're trying to think of a visual, especially. Sometimes it's hard to think, what can I show visually here? Think about what that point is you're trying to make, and give yourself a little brain space to imagine, like, what does that remind me of? It might be a visual metaphor that you're using at that point, or what's some way that I can show that graphically. That's the process you want to go through when you're looking for, how can I do this in a way that's not just the words on the screen. We don't have any more questions right now in the Q&A lineup. I believe we cleared all of those. So
there's one more that just came in. You don't want to know. Rachel just asked, how long did it take to prepare an hour presentation? I'll take a stab at this. So when I was a speechwriter 30 years ago, I used to say a minute of new content would usually take about an hour. So if you had to write a speech that was 10 minutes long, by the time I interviewed the organizer, the event people, interviewed my principal, what they wanted to say, did the research, drafted it, revised it, practiced it, it would take a good 10 hours. So I would say, I don't know if we wanted to estimate, Acacia, that we probably each put, between writing the playbook, I probably put about 30 or 40 hours into writing the playbook, which then became the basis for this webinar. And you've probably put a 15 or 20 hours in easily, between.
With our conversations about the webinar, it was probably another 30 hours. But I want to encourage people to know that we were looking at this also as we knew we were going to have upwards of 200 people on this webinar. So the stakes were higher for us. So we were looking for a higher stake presentation. And we also took it upon ourselves to really practice what we were preaching. And that took a lot of creativity and figuring out how we can practice and meta teach what we were trying to teach you within the content.
There was a lot of pressure because we're presenting you a webinar about being a good virtual speaker and being a virtual speaker while doing so. So
yes, it definitely had that.
It's a little bit of a loaded question. I would say that if you've, I think the rule of thumb is if you've got a minute of new content to plan on, a good hour. So if it's a 60-minute class, you may spend 60 hours, by the time from start to finish, everything all in. So don't let that distract you, but then your class is done and you get to rinse, wash, repeat it. We have a few other good questions coming in.
Yeah, I see the top one here about how you stay engaged and connected as a presenter when you're all by yourself in the room. What are you thinking? And I think I'm just going to give you kind of another acting trick because it is useful here. But when you're looking into that camera and you're all alone, I like to imagine a person that I'm speaking to that makes me feel good and that I can imagine listening to me and enjoying themselves. So I try to actually imagine that one person. My tip when you are doing things virtually is don't imagine a crowd of people, because at home, what people are actually experiencing feels more one-on-one than it does in a group, because the audience is alone at home too. So always try and speak as if you're speaking to one person, really, and try and imagine that person that you can speak to with energy and care. And that, for me at least, also makes me feel good.
There was a question about international presentations and it just went away. So I don't know, Helmut, if you can find it, but Shirley French asked a fantastic question about preparing for international audience.
They were asking about interpreters.
Oh, so.
And I said that we were starting to work on a project that would have that and that we would have some learnings to come.
Good. I just wanted to add that I actually interviewed, this isn't interpreters, but let's mention captions, because I think this is actually a really good time. We know that videos that are produced actually have higher resonation when they're captioned. So start there. Like if I'm having a hard time watching something on my TV, I might turn the captions on because there's noise around me. Or more importantly, if you're at your desk and you're watching a video and you don't want people to hear, you might just turn the captions on and read. So putting that against how do we interpret on live. So there are a few companies that will do live captioning. There's one in New York that we talked to last week, and they actually have interpreters, and Shirley, we're happy to get you their name. They have interpreters, they have live interpreters for 6 languages, and they have closed caption interpreters and translators for probably another 30. So those services do exist, and it's something that's not cheap, but it's really powerful and effective when you are needing a message to be translated live. I would recommend that if you've got an international audience, record it, have it in your record file, get it closed caption in the languages that you need, and play that version so people can choose the language that they want, as opposed to trying to do it live. So hopefully everyone's appreciating the difference there about live captioning isn't perfect. It actually misses a lot of things, but it can be effective. But closed captioning, which is done after, you can edit and make sure it's pretty close to being exact. So
I'm going to take Reagan's question here, which is, how should you prepare guest speakers? How do you set quality expectations for someone who's not typically involved with your organization and may not be able to dedicate a significant amount of prep time? And I think that we're working with one group right now that has done a really great job of sending playbooks to their speakers that have a lot of the kind of information that they want to be included, that have some standards, so you can set the standards. You could offer coaching if that's a possibility. Obviously, we believe in that. But then I think another thing you can do is, if you host an orientation for those speakers, treat the orientation in the style in which you want them to deliver later. So if you want them to have an engaging presentation, then make sure your orientation is as engaging, if not more engaging, than what you hope them to do in their own presentation. Because if you over-index with that behavior, they'll probably start to see what the expectation is for the presentations with this particular outside organization. I think we cleared them again. And
does anybody just want to raise their hand? Let's just pretend, does anybody just want to raise their hand and see if there's a way for us just to take a question that somebody didn't want to type?
See Danielle has her hand raised.
Okay, Danielle. Let's see. There we go. Danielle, so I'm going to unmute you. There you go. Danielle, what's your question?
Thank you both so much for your generous information today. You're both superheroes.
Oh.
My question is, I find in the people that I coach, they don't think about what they're going to wear and the background of their engagement to really have a full understanding. I've seen clothes hanging in the background on some of these programs that people actually want to be very successful in. Or both of you have put on makeup, which is so important, and sometimes
heroic, I might add, heroic. So let me give you, Danielle, I'm going to take a first stab at this. And the conference that thank you for your question. The conference that we're working with the thousands of speakers, actually, and this applies to Reagan's question as well, and I think this is a really good suggestion. It takes a little bit of extra staff time. But they have what's called might be called a ready room, where the day before you present, you actually show up to Zoom to test your sound, test your light, test your technology with the production team. And last night on our conference call, I actually asked the person that does the ready room, I said, do you actually coach people? Like if you've got dirty underwear and if they're kind of like over here on the screen, and do you actually coach them back and coax them into better positions? And she says, we can, and we can do as much of that as the client will want. So one of the things that you might do is encourage people who are going to be showing up live or even on a recorded is to spend, to have a 2-hour window where you say, hey, stop into this Zoom room for 5 minutes. You can have a waiting room, so you only have one at a time. In Zoom rooms, you can have waiting room where you're, only allowing certain people in. And you can spend 5 or 10 minutes and say, guess what, Acacia, that's really nice that you want to wear that shirt, but it's not going to work out. I actually told a longtime partner and speaker of mine on the very first Zoom call I had with him, coaching him for a talk, I said, you really need to close the closet door behind you. I mean, he had clothes falling out of it, all these kind of academic gowns, and he dismissed me and he's like, no, that's just my closet. The door won't shut. And 2 weeks later, when I got him back on the Zoom, he'd figured out how to shut the door and shoved all the clothes in it because he'd gotten so much feedback, it was distracting. So, I think that there's a point where we all have to sort of grow up and say this, it's sort of like saying, we have to be able to give feedback to each other in a productive way. And my best tip, and people not knowing, is just to say, can you point to me where your camera is? The tip that I already gave. And guess what? Then they say, oh, that's where I'm supposed to be looking. But I thought I was supposed to be looking down here. So that ready room idea before a live event might be a good strategy for you.
I appreciate that so much.
Anything else, Acacia, that you can think of?
No, I think that was a really great answer to that.
All right, let's do Joy. Hi, Joy.
Hi, thank you.
Where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Columbus.
Very good. Welcome.
So thank you so much. This has been really helpful. I work at a branding agency, and we work with clients a lot to show creative presentations. So they're kind of evaluating the creative. And I'm wondering if you think what you recommend, whether that's a Zoom room or a webinar, what you think is the best. We usually have about 10 people, and then we have a creative team presenting. I like being able to read the room because that's nice to get people's facial expression and also know when they might have a question. But some people don't turn on their cameras. I'm just not sure what you might recommend for when you're a presentation where you want to have maybe 10 minutes of speaking, but you also want them to feel free to engage with you and talk and actually hear their voices. What would you recommend?
I'll start and I'll say definitely a Zoom room, not a webinar. Okay. Because you have the possibility of breaking. So, you could use the breakout room and say, in one way, if you wanted certain people to present certain things to certain groups, that's one way you might be able to do it. But our best advice to people who are presenting new content or a pitch is, number one, make sure that you only have people talk one at a time. So, when you're in the pitch, you might sort of bounce back and forth between people, and we didn't talk a lot about this, but you can't actually change slides very quickly. You have to let things sort of sit on the screen because people might be distracted and not looking. And the same is true for speakers. Acacia and I have been very intentional. You know how hard it is for us to interrupt each other and go back and forth. So everyone's got to have a pretty distinct role. I would cut your content down and make sure that it fits within the attention span of your audience. And really, Joy, there's a great question that there's one of my favorite books right now. It's called The Art of Gathering. And the author, Priya Parker, asks 2 questions before you gather for any reason. The first one is, what's the purpose today of us gathering? And I think that really applies here. What is the purpose? To approve a campaign, to move forward, to approve a budget? What's the purpose? So making sure everyone's on the same page. But the second is, what does the audience need? And so putting that forward first is paramount. So what does that audience need in order to get to that goal? And I would put that at the top of your agenda, especially because attentions are short and you won't have them for very long. So knowing sort of how technology shifts when it comes to changing speakers, and then also really prioritizing why is it that you're meeting and what do you want to get out of it. Acacia, what else do you have to add?
I want to add to the what does the audience need idea, and that, Joy, when I think about trying to get people to participate on a webinar, when you want them to speak up in a meeting, that can be difficult. And I think I might have heard that a little bit in your question. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So to Ruth's point of give the audience what they need, you may need a conscious moment at the beginning where there's some easy to answer, like I did the 2-word question. You could do a question like that where you really limit what they say so you don't give away a lot of time, but you get everyone used to saying something out loud before you get to the times when you might be asking questions that might make someone a little more reticent to speak up. So creating that atmosphere up front, that's the kind of meeting we're going to have, is with a lot of back and forth, will help later when you need them to participate. Did that kind of get to between the two of us, did we get some thoughts there for you?
Yeah, that was super helpful. I just want to clarify, is a Zoom room different than a Zoom meeting, or are they the same thing?
Those are the same thing.
Okay, thank you so much. That was wonderful.
No problem.
Actually, Ruth, can I chime in here for a second?
Yes.
Zoom rooms and Zoom meetings are not the same thing. Zoom rooms is a software that you can use to sort of like create a conference room. So the Zoom room is something, think of it as a software system that you can create a conference room. And then you would use Zoom meetings to run that Zoom room.
So Joy, have you ever been in a simulated room where it actually looks like a conference table, or it has like a conference table feel? It's almost like an augmented reality That's what Helmut's talking about, which is a higher level of software. The meeting room is what we're discussing in terms of having breakouts, and that's the functional technology we interface with. It's worth knowing the difference. Thank you, Helmut, for the clarification.
Thank you.
My Helmut's in charge of our technology. I think
So,
we've answered all the questions, Ruth. And so let's do one last call if you want to raise your hand.
Ask us anything, and you can tell I've sat down because I've been standing for the last 2 hours, so I need it.
So Larry Smith, who's that, is asking a question. You want to unmute him?
Oh, I think I can do that. Hey, Larry.
Hey, everybody.
You get the furthest traveled award. Thanks for tuning in.
Yeah, I didn't get in where I was from on your word cloud, which is Berkeley. So obviously Google Meet is coming fast and furious, and I've looked at it a little bit. So I had two questions, which is, have you had time to sort of explore it? And part of my gut is that maybe it's more of like what you do with your family because it's easier for your mom or grandma to figure out. Or do we suspect currently before long they'll have all the tools Zoom has and maybe cheaper and maybe something else? And maybe it's too soon to ask the question, but I thought if anybody knew, you two would.
I will answer one part and then I'll let Acacia and Helmut jump in. When my test case was watching my 13 and 15-year-old transition their school from live to virtual, and one of them moved almost all to Zoom and one of them moved almost all to Google Meet. Within 3 weeks, the second one was almost all on Zoom. They couldn't stand the Google Meet technology. It had limits to its ability to number of people and interactivity, and it was apparently kind of staticky and janky. So my guess is that they are working hard to improve those things, but in the meantime, the kids, which are really picky about their technology, are loving Zoom. So I actually haven't investigated further because this has been working for me. Acacia, Helmut, you want to jump in if you know anything more?
I will say that I don't know all of the different technologies intimately. And we did look at different technologies when we started thinking about what we would use. But in the end, it came down to what we were going to also be most comfortable with. So my perspective is to pick the platform that you as the leader feel most comfortable with, knowing that you can then walk other people through it. So whether you're a WebEx person, a Zoom person, a Google Meet person, a Facebook Live person, whatever you decide to use for technology, if you know how to use it, then I think you can be successful with it. That's my perspective.
Larry, I will tell you one thing. Somebody did invite me to a Google Meet. I clicked on it. My Google Suite, which I have a subscription for Google Suite, which is the environment we work in for email and contacts and calendar, actually had a security level protection on it that wouldn't actually allow me into the Meet, which I didn't know at the time because it was the first time that I'd linked in. And so I didn't even try. I investigated later. I needed to allow a security measure to be unchecked, and I just called in and it worked fine for that particular meeting. But I think I have every imaginable app except Google Meet. I've got WebEx, we have Blue Jeans, we have Teams, when clients ask us to use it. But I would say, back to the point I made earlier, there's about 75 different platforms that are developing, and someone had a really good explanation that all of them are really good at something and not one is good at everything. So you may find that what works for you and what you're trying to do may not work for someone else, but it still could be good. So
thank you.
Where we're going. It's nice to hear from you.
Thanks.
Looks like we have a question from Amy Dell.
Amy Dell. I love hearing from friends. Hello, Amy Dell, calling from Licking County.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can,
yes,
you can.
Okay, great. I have two, what I think are probably short questions, and I apologize. In the last 5 minutes, I got distracted by a question from one of my kids. So if you already answered this,
okay.
I apologize. I heard you say early on, there are lots of ways to improve your skill at hosting a Zoom meeting, or how to use all the different tools and options within Zoom. Do you have a preferred or a recommended source for how I practice hosting a meeting? I've attended lots of them, but I need to up my skill, as do some of my colleagues at the foundation, as to how to host them. You know, we anticipate having some committee meetings and some board meetings coming up, so we want to do some practicing. So that's one question. And the second, I'll just ask you that so that you guys can take it from there. Do you ever have, how do you coach people through using a lot of these jolts and attention grabbing techniques with groups that might consider themselves too serious for them, or that you're wasting their time with silliness? I don't know how to phrase it any better than that, but do you get that kind of pushback ever from folks you're working with?
I can do the first one if you want to do the second one, Ruth.
Sure.
So your first question about hosting, I have a very strong perspective on this because we come up with it with coaching people for public speaking all the time. And I like to think of, you're in usually 3 different modes of behavior when you're trying to get better at something. You're either practicing, or you're training, or you're competing. So if you are Michael Phelps being a swimmer, you know, you might be just working on one stroke and like the certain movement of your arm and doing that over and over, and that's practicing. Training might be actually, you know, going the distance that you're going to go in the race and working a little harder. The stakes get a little bit higher in training. And then competing is when Michael Phelps gets and he has to dive into the water and swim. And people always ask him in interviews, what are you thinking about when you go to the starting blocks to race? And he always says, I'm thinking swimming fast. I got to swim fast. So we understand usually in sports how to break things down and practice, then train, then compete. When it comes to public speaking or hosting in this case, we typically wait for the competition time to find time to practice. So if you're finding that you're going to have to start doing a lot of hosting, I might encourage things like take your team meetings and tell your team, I know this is going to be a little weird and formal, but I'm going to practice these behaviors while we're having our meeting, because I need to practice in an environment where I can mess up. The rehearsal is a great time to also do training, because the rehearsal, you feel like you're doing it for real, and then you get used to it. And then when you get to competition and you're actually hosting, then hopefully you have enough training time and practice time under your belt that you can actually just get up there and host. You can just compete.
So I'll take the second question. Amy, did that answer your first question?
It was very helpful. It wasn't exactly, I wasn't specific enough in my question. I was asking, could you direct me very specifically online? Go to this site for the actual tips and techniques and click this button to do this. Where's the tutorial for how to use the tools within Zoom?
So two things when you're in the
what you provided.
when you're in
Dove into what I was excited about, Amy, sorry.
So here's the thing, you would be overwhelmed to know if you went to YouTube and said, how to Zoom using meeting room breakouts. There'll be a whole 4-minute video just for you. It won't be perfectly produced, and it won't have a SCORM compliant attribute to it, and it won't have but I have learned so much from YouTube in whether it's podcasting or drywalling and Zoom is overwhelmed right now with good YouTuber content. So I actually would just go there, and in 3, 4, or 5-minute videos, you'll probably learn what you need. And then also Zoom's channel on YouTube has a very robust set of videos. And in no time, I would just start to digest some of those. And then when you're in it, you'll know how to navigate through it. You got it. And then like even, Amy, here's a good example. This is my account that we're on, but when we logged in today, I immediately made Helmut the host. and then he made me a co-host, and then he made Acacia a co-host. And because we needed all of us to have the same functionality, but because it was my account, I needed to actually hand it over to Helmut. And those are things that you'll learn over time in terms of if you want somebody else to be doing something with you. But I would start with, the Zoom YouTube channel and just start to digest there. And if you have questions, we can certainly show you. We're not perfect experts, but just because we've been using it a lot, we sort of fumble our way through things. So let me answer the second question. I would not think about jolts as something silly. I would think about them as something that would be like a necessary component of any virtual meeting. And you could call them knowledge breaks. You could call them engagement moments. You could use any other maybe more sophisticated term that means essentially the same thing. We use them here today because we had some desire to entertain you. We wanted to keep you engaged and let you have some fun and see how it can happen that way. But somebody else asked this question in a different way about, like, if you're dealing with a serious topic, do you actually want to how do you use a jolt? So here's an example. It might be that you've got a board meeting and you need people, it's going to be a 2-hour board meeting, and you need people to really pay attention and stay with you, right? So it might be that the jolt is that, so you work at a community foundation. It might be that the jolt is, we're going to show some artwork from the kids at the program down the street, just as a little brain break. And we're going to just between agenda items. That could be a jolt. It could be inside your content. In TED events, a jolt is music, performance, art, poetry that helps all of the ginormous content that's coming at you sort of give a chance to break it up and to resonate it. It's still pretty serious what they're presenting, but it also gives the brain that sensation that it needs. So does that help? I think that it's really thinking about that first chapter about timing, and that we've got to give people a potty break, bio break, until I have a puppy. I'm still using it. It's just based on what we need, just to stand up. It could just be like, okay, everyone, we're just gonna have a stand-up break for 10 minutes or 2 minutes, and we want you to stand up and do whatever you need to do to move. All of those things, not necessarily the connecting the knowledge, but are helping you to reframe what you're learning. So
yeah, full. I think that I would capture it all under, it goes back to that consider your audience piece, and we tailor the jolts for the audience, will be fine.
Right. Yeah. I see lots of great people still here listening in. We are 3 minutes from our end. One of the goals that we always have is to be good to the contract of what we said we were going to do. And so if there's one more question, I think we have time, or Acacia, if there's anything else that we've missed that you wanted to wrap up with.
I don't see any other questions coming out. So I guess my final words that I would say is going back to what Amy just said, which is considering the audience, and that all of the lessons that we're trying to help spread are because our communications hopefully always been audience centric. And we just have a new format that we have to figure out. How do we be audience centric there? So I encourage you to get to know your audiences, learn what they appreciate, what they look for, keeping a few of the things we know about almost all audiences in mind.
And my sentiments exactly, and I'll just leave you with a few tips moving forward. Number one, make sure to watch the video again, take in the slides. We'll be sending all of this out in a day or two. We do blog a lot, and we do have a lot of tips on our website, articulationinc.com. Do look for a short podcast series from us in June. Acacia and I have picked apart this content, and we're interviewing about 9 or 10 subject matter experts on things like the jolt or the stoke, the polling, the hosting and vocal quality. We're going to give you a different way to learn a little bit more about those things, and these kind of 20 or 25-minute nuggets that will probably be produced hopefully by mid-June. And then look for us, because we're actually in the process of working on some micro learning on for those industries and folks that are really struggling with, how do I take my live content and transfer it? Rachel Bernhardt, you're in my mind as I say this. Healthcare, how do I train a doctor that used to present in person for an hour to be a presenter online? So we are going to continue to try to be helpful and relevant through this time, and we hope that you'll keep coming back. And please make sure at 3:30 today, you're going to get a survey from us, and we hope that you'll fill it out and give us honest feedback, because we love feedback. And I just want to give a shout out to our assistant Kim, and also to Helmut, our producer, who without whom we would not be able to do any of this, either keeping us on schedule or making sure we are supposed to be doing what we're doing, keeping our task list down. So Acacia, thank you very much for your partnership. We have a lot of fun together, which makes this very possible. And thank you all for showing up today at 3 o'clock. We'll close it out and wish you all a good day. Thanks again.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.